I'm particularly interested in how the technical details of some problem affect the politics. I'll give you an example. Over the last few years, Ram Ramanathan and Charlie Kennel and I and a bunch of other people have been doing a lot of work on short-lived climate pollutants like soot. And the science is very clear now that soot's probably a bigger part of climate change than people originally thought. And soot is interesting because it causes local health effects, respiratory disease and so on, and it causes global warming. Global warming by itself is a very hard problem to solve because the benefits of getting serious about global warming are diffused across all people around the planet. Whereas tackling soot is easier because there at least are some benefits that accrue back to the country that adopts costly measures to control the pollutant. And one of the biggest challenges in dealing with climate is how to get countries that are reluctant to do something about the problem. China, India, frankly most of the United States for that matter. How to get them to play ball. And so for me, politically, what's been interesting about all this work on soot is how it rewires the politics. And it's exciting to work with people actually at the frontier of doing the technical work on this topic, because they're telling us things about where the soot's coming from, which industrial activities, non-industrial activities are causing it. All of that has profound political implications about where you're going to start to control emissions, who's going to pay, who's going to lose from that, and so on. That, for me, is a sweet spot. I ended up doing actually very different things in college. I ended up getting a degree in history and science, so it's kind of history and philosophy of science, and then a lot of scientific classes, in particular around oceanography and a little bit in the atmosphere. I think the reason I'm working on climate is because I'm a pilot, and pilots fly through the atmosphere. And in college, I had an opportunity to be a teaching assistant for a class about the atmosphere, an atmospheric chemistry and physics class, and I thought, I'm a pilot. I know about the atmosphere, and actually I almost no atmospheric chemistry and physics. I learned very quickly, so I had to learn a lot very quickly, and it's a fascinating field. And that was the time when the ozone layer mysteries were being discovered and resolved, and in particular around the ozone hole. And it happened that one of the labs that I was hanging around was very heavily involved in that and flying aircraft into the ozone hole. And some of my first work was done on the ozone problem. And in graduate school, I eventually went and got a PhD in political science because I was interested in history and political management and so on. But I always have worked on questions that have a very high technical content. And some of the first work I did as a political scientist was understanding why countries had been so successful in managing the ozone layer problem. And that's led inevitably to working on the next big problem, where countries have not been so successful, which is climate change. I think the smartest career decision I made was to stick with the PhD. Early on in my PhD career, partly because I had come to the PhD not having studied political science in much depth or economics in much depth in college. All my peers, or almost all my peers, were on a different trajectory, and they saw a path and a direction that was much harder for me to see, and I'm glad I stuck with that. That's probably the smartest decision that I've made. I think also in retrospect, right when I finished my PhD, my main thesis advisor, Gene Skolnikoff, helped me get a job at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And for an academic, doing that was a terrible idea because it meant not going on the path where you'd be publishing academic articles right out of graduate school. But for somebody whose interests are diverse and not entirely academic, it was fantastic because there were all these people coming through the council, and I ended up running a group of mainly physicists and biologists and people who worked on areas of foreign policy that had a very high science and technical content, and that's what I do, and that was terrific. For me, the biggest change was when I moved from the Council on Foreign Relations in New York to Stanford University in 2001. I set up a lab, a research group at Stanford that worked on energy markets, and over the course of the decade that followed, I've done a lot more work on the fundamentals of how the energy markets actually function. Natural gas, oil, coal markets as well. I've learned a tremendous amount from that. It's very hard to get serious about the climate problem without understanding how the main causes of climate change, which are human emissions of pollutants that come ultimately from fossil fuels, how those markets actually function. What I say to people is to work on interesting problems, and a very large part of the trick in doing research of this type is finding how to make the problem just the right size that it can be tackled. You don't want a problem that's so narrow that you've focused a laser on this really narrow problem, but you've arrived at a really narrow and uninteresting answer. Although sometimes narrow problems produce very interesting answers. You don't want problems that's so big that you just sprawling words and ideas, and it's not clear what's causing what. One of the hardest things to do in social science is to figure out cause and effect. Which factors are causing which outcomes? And a lot of the methodological advances and theoretical advances are really oriented around the fact that social life is very complex and difficult to understand, and so we need theories that tell us things about cause and effect relationships, and we need to be able to go out and measure those in the world. One of the things I tell students, and all of us tell each other all the time, is time management is crucial. I spend a lot of time organizing my day so that I have large chunks of time, sadly not every day, but large chunks of time where you can work on a problem and work on it in an unstructured way. That's how you make real advances. And the people who don't manage their time well are just right out of the blocks going to have a much harder time making big advances because your mind is too fragmented, your day is too fragmented. You've got to find a way to both manage your schedule so that you've got time to think and work in teams and so on, but you've also got to manage your office and your lab and so that it's efficient, so that the apparatus that's needed to make modern scientific research actually functions well and it doesn't eat you alive. The bureaucracy doesn't eat you alive and so on. And I have found it often very important to as you meet people in very different walks of life, CEOs, entry-level professionals in a company, who it seems are doing a good job of organizing the infrastructure that is needed to allow one to think and work on problems, to ask them how they do it. How do they organize their time? How do they manage their office? How do they delegate authority? How do they deal with authority that's been delegated to them? There's all that stuff that we're never really taught in graduate school. It's about functioning well in organizations, especially in large organizations, that if done well is liberating, and if not done well, will cause you to implode.